Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Irish in the American Civil War Campfire Chats. I'm Damien Shields.
And I'm Brendan Hamilton.
How's it going? We're going to chat today just about one of the units I think that gets referenced a lot in relation to the Irish and the Irish Brigade, particularly in 1862 when it was attached to that brigade, and look at some of the kind of myths that have been attached to it. At least I think it's fair to say we think it's somewhat of a myth. And it's the 29th Massachusetts Infantry. So anybody who's interested in the Irish Brigade at Antietam through much of the summer of 1862 knows that the 29th Massachusetts Infantry, which wasn't one of the ethnic Irish Green Flag regiments, as we would call them, was attached to the Irish Brigade during that period. And often when you read about it or you hear people talk about it, they get referred to as the Yankee Pilgrims, that they were a Protestant regiment, that they weren't Irish, they didn't have Irish people in them. They were the Mayflower descendants, all of these guys, so that they had no connection to the Irish regiments that they were fighting beside. But myself and Brendan have discussed this on and off over the years. And we wanted to just kind of do this chat to explore just how true was that, how non-Irish were the 29th Massachusetts. And people talk about them not being Irish. And I think it's fair to say the 29th spoke about themselves as not Irish as well. If you look at their own history, we've took a bit of a dive in. They wrote their own history, 29th Massachusetts Infantry, in 1877, and they remarked, this is what they say about themselves. They say, "We were essentially an American regiment, very largely composed and officered by men who were direct descendants of the early settlers of the Plymouth and Bay colonies. Yet it was cordially welcomed to the brigade," and in this they're referencing the Irish Brigade, "by its officers and members." So it's them who put out this idea that they were all non-Irish, that they were all fully American, and that it was completely alien for most of their men to be serving beside the Irish Brigade. It was something too, I think it's fair to say, that the Irish Brigade, the other regiments, and Thomas Francis Meagher referenced to the fact that they were not Irish. He called them in his speech, Thomas Francis Meagher, the Brigadier General, and of course the man mainly responsible for the foundation of the Irish Brigade, he called them the sons of Pilgrims and Puritans. So again, really identifying them as something very, very different to the largely Catholic Irish who were fighting in the 63rd, the 69th, and the 88th New York in this period of the war. I often wonder if Meagher might have been a bit, when he was making that reference, some members of 29 Massachusetts had apparently just stolen some of his whiskey around the time he gave that speech, although he doesn't seem to have been particularly bitter about it, which is, for Meagher, that was good. That was good. But so there are other incidents that kind of, reflected how non-Irish they were. So towards the end of their service with the Irish Brigade, Thomas Francis Meagher and the officers, because of how well they had served together, particularly at places like Antietam, and during the 7 days, towards the end of the 7 days, they tried to present them with a green flag to kind of welcome them in, even though they weren't Irish, as part of the regiment. And that didn't go down very well. They actually refused it to 29 Massachusetts. And they seem to actually have been not terribly happy about the fact that they were given it in the first place. Although, again, everything was very cordial, but they had their own identity, and their identity, and the one that they wanted to project after the war, just as the Irish Brigade wanted to project their Irishness, 29 Massachusetts wanted to project this idea that they were all these sons of the original colonists of Massachusetts. But is it true? Yeah, is it true? And so we're going to take you through a few different elements of this. It's not going to be a terribly long chat, but just to give you an idea what's to come, Brendan's going to chat through us about the formation of the 29th, bit of their service. Then I'm going to look specifically at Antietam, at the regiment there, and to see what, looking at the casualties that they suffer at Antietam, tell us about how Irish or not the 29th Massachusetts were. I should say, and it's only fair to give a shout out, I was kind of one of the reasons behind us finally doing this was anyone who listens to the brilliant Antietam and Beyond podcast, recently started by John Banks and Tom Macmillan. Really, really good show if you haven't heard it. I was on there recently talking about the Irish Brigade at Antietam. And again, this idea of the 29th Massachusetts, not mentioned in that, but it struck me that this is something we need to discuss, is the 29th Massachusetts and their Irishness. And so that kind of inspired that. So I would encourage you to check out the guys' podcast to find out a bit more about Antietam. And you can hear us talking a bit about the Irish Brigade on it as well. But okay, Brendan, the 29th Massachusetts. Tell us a bit about them, and tell us, is there any indications that they might not all have been the sons of the first settlers in Massachusetts?
So there are certainly indications there. And, like any stories and generalizations, there are sometimes grains of truth that you find, and then other things that go completely against the dominant narrative. So first, to talk about the 29th, though, and I don't want to get too into the weeds about it, but their origins lay in the 3rd and 4th Massachusetts militia units, right, which were 90 days units early in the war, but contained a lot of 3 years volunteers. So the regiment, the nucleus of the regiment, formed out of these 3-year men who were kind of consolidated from these militia units.
Okay.
And looking through these units company by company, we get a better sense of where these guys were coming from. So to start with the first 7 companies that first came from the 3rd and 4th Massachusetts, you got Company A that was recruited in Boston. Then Company B, another Boston-based company. Company C was recruited in East Bridgewater in Plymouth County, Massachusetts. Then Company D was called the Sandwich Guards because they were recruited in Sandwich, Massachusetts. Company E, which is where I think a lot of the mythology comes from, was called the Plymouth Rock Guards, and they were formed out of a pre-war militia company that was called the Standish Guards. They were organized in Plymouth, and they were named after Miles Standish, the famous, Pilgrim governor. Among the privates of this unit actually was a 20-year-old named Miles Standish, who was himself a direct male descendant of the Miles Standish.
That's some connection,
right? And he's referenced in the regimental history, but they don't actually say him by name. They just say, "Hey, we have this descendant of Miles Standish in the unit." But then you get Company I, was called the Union Guard, was recruited in Lynn, Massachusetts, which was an industrial town that, much like Boston, had a lot of Irish laborers.
There's a lot of non-Plymouth Pilgrim descendants who would be potentially joining some of these companies based on their locations.
Absolutely. Then let's see, Company K was the Greenough Guard, which was recruited in East Boston, which was the site of a lot of the big shipyards and another hub of Irish immigration. So then in December 1861, they rounded it out to 10 companies by adding 3 brand new ones. Company G was actually not even from Massachusetts, but recruited in and around Pawtucket, Rhode Island, another hub of Irish immigration.
Yep.
Company H from Charlestown, Massachusetts, another big Irish neighborhood. And then Company F said that they boasted that they represented nearly every county in eastern Massachusetts. But I find it interesting, even when we're talking about Plymouth County, you had a large Irish population there as well, not as significant as Boston, of course, but it's a seacoast region, fishermen and sailors. You have working class shoemakers, glass workers. The Plymouth Cordage Company is there making rope and cordage. So you would have seen a lot of Irish in that area as well.
It's interesting given the image that they project themselves, isn't it? The 29th Massachusetts.
Yeah. And
it's interesting in considering in regimental history, like of when we're reading them back, and of course you always have to be cautious about reading these written after the fact, but what's presented and who are the people presenting it, that maybe some of the key officers you'd imagine are playing key roles in forming the identity that they want to give. It's certainly not the privates who are saying, well, this is what we are and where we come from. I'm sure some of them were like that. But there's every indication there, if you were looking at a standard Massachusetts regiment, at that period of war, you would expect that regiment to have a considerable number of Irish in it based on its recruitment locations. All of those. And we know, for example, because places where industry was impacted by the early months of the war as well, by the secession crisis, where an awful lot of guys, and you see it a lot in Massachusetts and a lot of those industrial places, you see it a lot in Rhode Island, where guys talk about how it was a difficult time to get work for Irish factory workers, for Irish shoemakers around that sort of period. So it makes them even more likely to be looking to try and enlist in a unit, apart from looking to respond to the national crisis, if you like.
Yeah. And I think you make a really good point about the officers, because the vast majority of the officers of the regiment were native born.
Yeah.
Anglo-Americans, with a few notable examples there.
Yeah, and I think
counter examples, I should say.
I think that's the key to where the kind of this idea, this juxtaposition that they're just so different, that they're so non-Irish in comparison. And that really is the impression that's given, that really it would be difficult to find much more of a non-Irish unit to be fighting alongside the Irish Brigade, isn't it? I mean, you do get that feeling all the time.
And it makes for a good story.
It does make for a good story. And of course, it serves both sides in a way. And you could see Mara using it as well. Like there was this coming together of these two kind of wildly different, like Americans. They couldn't be more American. And then the recent immigrants, but they come together in tough circumstances and fight together against their common enemy, of course, which is the Confederacy. So it creates a good narrative story. It's probably worth, just before we dive into the actual Antietam thing, just to talk about like how long. I don't know. Do you want to do that, Brendan, or I can chat about it? Just their actual service with the brigade when they come, they join up with the Irish Brigade, and how long they're with them for.
Oh, I mean, you're welcome to.
Yeah, no problem. So like it's not a very long relationship. So they don't actually become part of the brigade. And remember, the Irish Brigade at this period is famous later in the war at Fredericksburg and things for having the 28 Massachusetts and the 116 Pennsylvania with it. But in the early parts, in the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, it's just those three core New York regiments, which also have Massachusetts men in them and everything, but we won't go into that. But in any event, the 63rd, the 69th, and the 88th New York Infantry are the 3 years men of the Irish Brigade who were there initially, who go down. But it's on the 9th of June that General Israel Richardson, just after the Battle of Fair Oaks, attaches the 29th Massachusetts Infantry to the Irish Brigade to serve with them through the following few months. And so they fight side by side at a number of famous battles, and battles that are well known for what the Irish Brigade does at them: Gaines Mill, Savage Station, White Oak Swamp, Glendale, Malvern Hill. They're there all the time with the Irish Brigade. So some of its most famous engagements. And then, of course, there is the main one in which they're engaged with them, and that's at Antietam. And that's their last battle with the Irish Brigade. They leave them before the Irish Brigade attacks the stone wall at Fredericksburg. And actually, it's quite interesting in their 29th Massachusetts history. They're quite honest about the fact that they were really thankful that they were out of the brigade before that mass sacrifice against the stone wall at Marie's Heights, which is interesting, that they say that, like, that we were fortunate to be away when the brigade suffered so terribly at Fredericksburg. But of course, they did suffer terribly at Antietam as well. But and again, if you are interested in this, I would encourage you to listen to John and Tom's podcast, and particularly when we're talking about the Irish Brigade, because we talk about the kind of phenomenal differential casualties that are caused in the brigade based on where they were in the line of battle coming up to the sunken road at Antietam. And the 29th Massachusetts really are the most fortunate in their positioning. Because the regiments, the Irish, the proper Irish, if you like, regiments beside them suffer really terrible casualty figures purely by accident to geography. If you've never had an opportunity to walk some of that ground or to examine it, it's well worth it to see. Number one, it's not a hugely long line that the Irish Brigade are forming at that battle, but just how the vagaries of whether you were completely exposed or had a small bit of cover in front of your regimental front, what it meant for, whole communities being devastated. But that said, the 29th Massachusetts did not escape without losing men there. And if we look at their casualty figures and strength, they carried about 380 men into the Battle of Antietam, 29th Massachusetts. At the engagement, they lost 7 killed, 29 wounded, and 3 missing for a total of 39 men. So this is an American regiment that does not have very many Irish in it. So let's look at some of the casualties. The only outright fatalities that they suffer in companies A and B of the 29th Massachusetts, they're Boston, I think, were they, Brendan? Those companies around that area anyway, are Irish American. Mortally wounded in action, Corporal Timothy Donovan, 29th Massachusetts. He was a blacksmith from South Street, hugely Irish area. He was born in Boston in 1841, but both his parents were Irish immigrants. His mother, Ellen, received a pension after what happened to him at Antietam. Killed in action was Private Edward O'Donnell, who was from Mechanic Street in Boston. He was born there around 1840. His parents were married in Ireland in 1830, almost certainly in the northwestern county Donegal. And his mother, Sarah, claimed a pension after it. So here we're seeing instantaneously the impact of the 29th Massachusetts, the American unit in the Irish Brigade at Antietam, losing Irish people. Irish community members are being impacted by their losses. Wounded, and again, this is just, listen to the names: Joseph J. Farrell, Martin Mullen, Edward Kelly, who we know was born in County Cork. Kelly had his leg amputated as a result of the injuries he took in the 29th Massachusetts at Antietam. That's just Company A. Company B, killed in action, Private John J. O'Brien, 18 years old at the time he fought at Antietam. He'd already been taken prisoner of war at Savage Station and only been paroled that August. His mother, Mary, who was in Lowell, a huge Irish community there, received a pension. And she had been married in County Roscommon in Ireland in 1833. And John was born there. He was from County Roscommon. He was a 17-year-old mill hand in 1860. Again, a Lowell Irish mill hand. I'm not sure whether there are many Irish people in Lowell who weren't working in things like in the mills there. One of the things that survives relating, again, to the 29th Massachusetts is this letter sent to this County Roscommon woman about her County Roscommon son who dies at Antietam. I'll read it here. Again, this is, as with a lot of these, I'm sure not read very much over the years since, but it was written by one of the regimental officers from Harper's Ferry on the 26th of September, 1862. Mrs. O'Brien, it is my sad duty to announce to you the death of your son, John J. O'Brien. He was killed by a ball from the enemy September the 17th, 1862 in the Battle of Antietam Creek. He was hit on the arm and in the side and lived but an hour or two after receiving his wound. He died as a soldier should at his post, doing his duty, and I am glad to say that he was always a faithful, attentive and brave boy. And as you have lost a good son, the country has lost a good soldier. He was visited by the priest in his last moments. So here is an advantage taken. He was fortunate. His family would have taken great comfort from the fact that because he was serving in the Irish Brigade, he had access to a priest. He was visited by the priest in his last moments, and his wounds were attended to by his friends and members of his company. They buried his body neatly, and the spot is marked by a simple headboard. The few keepsakes in his knapsack are now with William Short and will be sent to you by him. The officers and men of the company extend to you their deepest sympathy in this your great trial. May you find consolation in the fact that your son gave up his life bravely for his country in the hour of her need. Yours with sympathy and respect, Ezra Ripley, 1st Lieutenant commanding Company B, 29th Regiment, Massachusetts Infantry. So again, this is showing us that the Irish experience extends to the 29th Massachusetts Infantry at Antietam. The impact of Antietam extends out of the 29th into Irish communities in Massachusetts as well. There's more and more of these guys from Antietam. Another one who was wounded, Charles McNulty, again, Massachusetts born to Irish parents. He had his right leg amputated as a result of his injuries there. Philip Sullivan, who was born in Ireland, was missing in action at Antietam and actually was later listed a deserter. Company F, killed in action, Private Edward Rattigan, 35 years old. Company K, Thomas Dolan from Ballinamore in County Leitrim, who was wounded in the chest at Antietam and then was reported as deserted from hospital. difficult to blame anyone who decides to desert after an engagement like that. There's more and more that you can go through in this history of the unit, but I think that gives you an idea just from those Antietam casualties of the extent to which the 29th Massachusetts was not just an American regiment filled with the descendants of the people who came to Plymouth and the Bay State Colony, that there were Irish all among it. And Brennan, you have another story, not related to Antietam per se, but about another of these Irish American boys who serve in the unit.
I do. So I've been studying the history of some of the enlistees who served who were inmates in the Massachusetts State Reform School prior to the war. And I found 6 or 7 in the 29th Massachusetts. And interestingly enough, there's a Miles Standish matching the name and age of that Miles Standish, who may have been in the Reform School as well prior to it, but I haven't found enough information to know for certain.
It would be incredible if it was the same guy.
Because most of his fellow inmates were Irish Americans. And that includes Joseph McAlevey. And his case history record, which as the inmates came in, they took down notes of their life prior to when they were convicted and sentenced, and then left a few notes about their time sometimes in the Reform School. So it gives us a great sort of portrait of their pre-war lives and who these people were.
Yeah.
And McAlevy's is especially intriguing because there's a great deal of detail there. We know that he was born in Albany, New York in 1842 to Irish immigrant parents, Henry and Rosetta McAlevey. He was one of 8 children. And though he was born in Albany, he lived in the Boston and Roxbury area most of his life. His father had died when he was about 10 years old. His mother, Rosetta, worked as a dressmaker and kept a small store to support the family. We know that they were Roman Catholic. They regularly attended Mass, and that Joseph went to Sunday school. In terms of his regular schooling, though, he left around the age of 11. Probably not a coincidence that it was soon after his father's death. He worked in a dry goods store, a cap store, and a glass works. And then they documented that his criminal history started with him stealing apples in the company of a group of other boys. And then finally in 1857, when he was 15 years old, he was sentenced to the State Reform School for stealing lead with one other boy. And that's something you see a lot in roofing and other construction purposes. Lead was used.
Yeah.
And so boys in the Boston area and New York City as well, they often would strip the lead from buildings. And there were unscrupulous junk dealers out there that would then pay the boys for that raw material. Oftentimes recruiting, or at least it was suspected that they were recruiting them secretly to go and strip material.
Running them as little gangs almost.
Yeah. And so they don't, and interestingly, they don't often go into, in these documents, gangs and organized crime, but it's certainly a lot of times it feels that way.
Yeah.
They do say that in terms of his background, they described him as profane and untruthful. And as evidence said that he went to theaters and, quote, Negro concerts was their examples of theaters, especially in those days, were thought of as places where, working class people went to engage in untoward behavior.
Yeah, get up to no good.
But he himself, McAlevey himself, was a musician. It said he traveled around the country for 5 weeks with a group called Penn's Opera Troupe as a dancer. And he also formed his own concert band with other boys in the area that had basically just started and had 2 performances right before he got arrested.
Incredible detail, isn't it? It's incredible
It
stuff.
really is. And then
Yeah.
they described his time at the reform school. They described him as, quote, a very active and sweet boy, and mentioned that he's a great performer on the tambourine and assisted in their boys' concerts that they gave in the town of Westboro there. So,
And he
things went well in the reform school. A lot of times you see them documenting punishments, and the corporal punishments were oftentimes really brutal. Whippings, canings. They had a thing called the sweat box that they would confine people in. But there's no record of that
for him.
And it seems like he was discharged prior to his enlistment. There were a number of boys who enlisted in regiments directly from the institution, but he was discharged possibly to be indentured, since he had that glass worker background. He ended up in the glass industry.
And we should say, shouldn't we, Brendan, that, people, because of the indenture thing, like you know a lot more about this than me, but I've seen that with some of the guys in New York, where if they were in care, they could be sent out west, for example, to work on a farm or similar. And you see them, Barney Carr, who's a guy I've written about, that happened to him. His mother was looking for him. He was sent out west to work on a farm. He enlisted in the Illinois regiment that gets killed at Kennesaw Mountain as a result of that. But I don't think people realize that actually happened that much, do they?
Yeah. And the orphan train program, they boasted about the number of their, I guess they would call them beneficiaries, but they boasted how many of them ended up in the Civil War service, and said that you could feel the whole regiment from
with them.
The orphan train. Yeah. And a lot of them, obviously, in Western regiments. And
what happened to him then in the 29th Massachusetts?
So he enlisted in May 1861. It's he would have been with them certainly through the Peninsula Campaign. There's a little vagary on the muster roll abstracts around the period of Antietam, if he was there or not.
Right.
But possibly right after. He was in a hospital on Harper's Ferry, sick.
Okay.
And it was from that hospital in April of 1863 that he deserted. And again, a lot of times you did have soldiers who were ill for periods of time who, as soon as they were able to do so, got snuck out of the hospitals.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So it's not impossible that he was actually at Antietam then.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. And
they actually tracked him down. So he was arrested in Boston the following August too.
Okay.
Where he was probably sentenced to, they would have been confined and sentenced to hard labor. But he kind of slips off the record, so I don't know what happened to him after the war.
So they don't force him to go back and finish out his time with the regiment then?
Correct.
Yeah, okay. That's interesting. I mean, that's about as far away from the image of the 29th Massachusetts that a lot of us have, as you can get. A young Irish American boy who'd been arrested, having stolen apples and lead, ending up in the unit and fight alongside his fellow countrymen. I think we won't spend too much longer going it, but I think it is worth us, just as we're kind of wrapping it up in relation to anyone. It's just, there are others, other Irish, again, not associated with Antietam, that we can talk about, that are connected. There's an Irish guy in the unit who's actually killed at Fredericksburg in the 29th Massachusetts, even though they have a much better experience there. Edward Carroll, 35-year-old courier, who'd married a Irish Canadian. He's killed with the regiment at the most famous Irish Brigade battle of them all, but not with the Irish Brigade anymore. People may know that we're running the Andersonville Irish Project on the site at the moment, and we're having a look at trying to identify all the Irish at Andersonville who died at Andersonville. But one of the Andersonville Irish is a 29th Massachusetts Infantry veteran that we've identified. He was called William O'Connor. Again, doesn't get much more Irish than that. He'd enlisted in August of 1862. He was 42 years old. And again, we see that a lot at Andersonville, where the older guys are more susceptible to dying there. We know that he was actually on hospital duty to care for wounded after Antietam. So he was there, and then he was caring for wounded in and around the battlefield afterwards. He came from County Mayo originally, and he was captured after the 29th had left. One of the places they served was down in Knoxville in East Tennessee. He was captured there in November of 1863 and died of chronic diarrhea on the 17th of October, 1864. And he's in the National Cemetery in Andersonville in grave 11080. You were mentioning a Medal of Honor recipient, Brendan.
Yes. Sergeant Jeremiah Mahoney of Company A. He was born in Fall River, Massachusetts, but was the son of Irish immigrants. He received the Medal of Honor for helping to capture the flag of the 17th Mississippi Infantry at the Battle of Fort Sanders during the Knoxville Campaign.
So on and on it goes. I think we wouldn't want to overstate it, right? We're not saying that the 29th Massachusetts was an Irish regiment or even a largely Irish regiment. Plenty of the guys in it were not Irish. The majority of them were not. But I think the point is that they're not as alien as to the guys in and around them. And indeed, if you look at Antietam, significant numbers of the casualties they take in front of that the bloody lane there are Irish American. And so maybe a slight reframing of how we think about the 29th Massachusetts and how different it was is needed. And it does feed into kind of the wider thing. It's a point I've made ad nauseum, really, that if we want to find the majority Irish experience, actually, the American Civil War, it isn't in the Irish Brigade. It isn't in those ethnic green flag units. It's in units like the 29th Massachusetts. The experience that they're having in that regiment is much more typical of what Irish Americans, the majority of this, around 250,000 of them, who serve in the US military have. It is that. And you can't pick a Massachusetts or a New York or a Pennsylvania, in particular, those three states, regiment that recruits any companies out of an urban area that isn't filled with Irish. And I think that's the main point. But
can I mention Charles Brady real quick too?
Yeah,
Sorry,
go for it. Go for it.
But first lieutenant and later captain of Company D was Charles Brady, was a native of County Cavan. But
he'd have to be with a surname like that.
Right. And not only was he a working class Irish immigrant, but he was elected president and chairman of the first regimental reunion in 1870, which to me was really surprising. For them to choose him as, that representative and post-war leader.
That's really interesting, particularly given the kind of persona that they had. Yeah. I think it is, and we probably would want to state they had really good relations with the other Irish. And I wonder is that maybe part of it as well. Part of their identity does get kind of caught up in their time with the Irish Brigade, and they were proud of that time.
Yeah.
And I think they were just trying to accentuate we weren't actually the Irish Brigade, we were somebody different. We were our own regiment. And then maybe in that, then they become just a bit too separated from the kind of mainstream of Irish American service in the war.
Yeah.
But I suppose we'll wrap it up at that. We're going to be hopefully doing quite a bit more of these in the future. I should give a bit of a plug for some of Brendan's work on the House of Industry Boys. If you check out the site at IrishAmericanCivilWar.com, you can find some pieces that Brendan has written about that work. It's absolutely astonishing work. Really well worth reading about these guys who aren't kind of among the normal, these early war volunteers that we all think we know about. These don't kind of fit that mold so much. But certainly check that out. And we have a lot of Antietam themed posts on the site as well. It's certainly one of the more major ones. But that's great. Listen, thanks everybody for listening, and hopefully we'll see you again soon for one of these chats.
Thanks, Damien.